22. Know how to end things. The exit strategy. You are judged in this world by how well you bring things to an end. A messy or incomplete conclusion can reverberate for years to come, ruining your reputation in the process. The art of ending things well is knowing when to stop, never going so far that you exhaust yourself or create bitter enemies that embroil you in conflict in the future. It also entails ending on the right note with energy and flair. It is not a question of simply winning the war, but the way you win it, the way your victory sets you up for the next round. The height of strategic wisdom is to avoid all conflicts and entanglements from which there are no realistic exits. Ending as beginning. As a young man, Lyndon B. Johnson had just one dream: to climb the ladder of politics and become president. When Johnson was in his mid-20s, the goal was starting to seem unreachable. A job as the secretary of a Texas congressman had allowed him to meet and make an impression on President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had named him the Texas director of the National Youth Administration, a post promising excellent political connections. But Texas voters were extremely loyal, often returning congressmen to their seat for decades or until they died. Johnson urgently wanted a seat in Congress. If he did not get one soon enough, he would be too old to climb the ladder, and he burned with ambition. On February 22, 1937, out of the blue, the chance of a lifetime opened up. The Texas Congressman James Buchanan suddenly died. The seat he left empty, that of Texas's 10th District, was a rare opportunity, and the state's eligible political heavyweights immediately threw their hats in the ring. The many contenders included Sam Stone, a popular county judge, Shelton Polk, an ambitious young Austin attorney, and C.N. Avery, Buchanan's former campaign manager, the favorite to win. Avery had the support of Tom Miller, mayor of Austin, the 10th District's only large city. With Miller's backing, he could count on almost enough votes to win the election. Johnson was faced with a terrible predicament. If he entered the race, the odds would be absurdly against him. He was young, only 28, and in the district he was unknown and poorly connected. A bad loss would damage his reputation and set him far back on the road to his long-term goal. If he chose not to run, on the other hand, he might wait 10 years for another chance. With all this in mind, he threw caution to the winds and entered the race. Johnson's first step was to call to his side the dozens of young men and women whom he had helped or hired over the years. His campaign strategy was simple. He would separate himself from the other contenders by presenting himself as Roosevelt's staunchest supporter. A vote for Johnson was a vote for the president, the popular architect of the New Deal. And since Johnson could not compete in Austin, he decided to aim his army of volunteers at the countryside, the sparsely populated hill country. This was the district's poorest area, a place where candidates rarely ventured. Johnson wanted to meet every last farmer and sharecropper, shake every possible hand, win the votes of people who had never voted before. It was the strategy of a desperate man who recognized that this was his best and only chance for victory. One of Johnson's most loyal followers was Carroll Keach, who would serve as his chauffeur. Together the two men drove every square mile of the hill country, tracing every dirt path and cow trail. Spotting some out-of-the-way farmhouse, Johnson would get out of the car, walk to the door, introduce himself to the startled inhabitants, listen patiently to their problems, then leave with a hearty handshake and a gentle plea for their vote. Convening meetings in dusty towns consisting mainly of a church and a gas station, he would deliver his speech, then mingle with the audience and spend at least a few minutes with everyone present. He had an incredible memory for faces and names. If he happened to meet the same person twice, he could recall everything he or she had said the first time around. And he often impressed strangers by knowing someone who knew them. He listened intensely and was always careful to leave people with the feeling that they would see him again, and that if he won, They would finally have someone looking out for their interests in Washington. In bars, grocery stores, and gas stations all through the Hill Country, he would talk with the locals as if he had nothing else to do. On leaving, he would make sure to buy something: candy, groceries, gasoline, a gesture they greatly appreciated. He had the gift of creating a connection. As the race ran on, Johnson went days without sleep, his voice turning hoarse, his eyes drooping. As Keach drove the length of the district, he would listen in amazement as the exhausted candidate in the car muttered to himself about the people he had just met, the impression he had made, what he could have done better. Johnson never wanted to seem desperate or patronizing. It was that last handshake and look in the eye that mattered. The polls were deceptive. They continued to show Johnson behind, but he knew he had won votes that no poll would register. And in any case, he was slowly catching up. By the last week, he had crept into third place. Now, suddenly, the other candidates took notice. The election turned nasty. Johnson was attacked for his youth, for his blind support of Roosevelt, for anything that could be dug up. Trying to win a few votes in Austin, Johnson came up against the political machine of Mayor Miller, who disliked him and did everything possible to sabotage his campaign. Undeterred, Johnson personally visited the mayor several times in that last week to broker some kind of truce. But Miller saw through his charm. His personal appeal might have won over the district's poorest voters, but the other candidates saw a different side of him. He was ruthless and capable of slinging mud. As he rose in the polls, he made more and more enemies. On Election Day, Johnson pulled off one of the greatest upsets in American political history, outdistancing his nearest rival by 3,000 votes. Exhausted by the grueling pace he had set, he was hospitalized. But the day after his victory, he was back at work. He had something extremely important to do. From his hospital bed, Johnson dictated letters to his rivals in the race. He congratulated them for running a great campaign. He also described his own victory as a fluke, a vote for Roosevelt more than for himself. Learning that Miller was visiting Washington, Johnson telegraphed his connections in the city to chaperone the mayor and treat him like royalty. As soon as Johnson left the hospital, he paid visits to his rivals and acted with almost embarrassing humility. He even befriended Polk's brother, driving him around town to run errands. A mere 18 months later, Johnson had to stand for re-election, and these one-time opponents and bitter enemies suddenly turned into the most fervent Johnson believers, donating money, even campaigning on his behalf. And Mayor Miller, the one man who had hated Johnson the most, now became his strongest supporter and remained so for years to come. Interpretation. For most of us, the conclusion of anything, a project, a campaign, an attempt at persuasion, represents a kind of wall. Our work is done, and it is time to tally our gains and losses and move on. Lyndon Johnson looked at the world much differently. An ending was not like a wall, but more like a door leading to the next phase or battle. What mattered to him was not gaining a victory, but where it left him, how it opened onto the next round. What good would it do to win the election of 1937 if he were thrown out of office 18 months later? That would be a devastating setback to his dream of the presidency. If, after the election, he had basked in his moment of triumph, he would have sown the seeds of failure in the next election. He had made too many enemies. If they didn't run against him in 1938, they would stir up trouble while he was away in Washington. So Johnson immediately worked to win these men over, whether with charm, with meaningful gestures, or with clever appeals to their self-interest. He kept his eye on the future and on the kind of success that would keep him moving forward. Understand, in any venture, your tendency to think in terms of winning or losing, success or failure, is dangerous. Your mind comes to a stop instead of looking ahead. Emotions dominate the moment, a smug elation in winning, dejection and bitterness in losing. What you need is a more fluid and strategic outlook on life. Nothing ever really ends. How you finish something will influence and even determine what you do next. Some victories are negative, they lead nowhere, and some defeats are positive, working as a wake-up call or lesson. This fluid kind of thinking will force you to put more strategic emphasis on the quality and mood of the ending. It will make you look at your opponents and decide whether you might do better to be generous to them at the end, taking a step back and transforming them into allies, playing on the emotions of the moment. Keeping your eyes on the aftermath of any encounter, you will think more of the feeling you leave people with, a feeling that might translate into a desire to see more of you. By understanding that any victory or defeat is temporary and that what matters is what you do with them, you will find it easier to keep yourself balanced during the thousands of battles that life entails. The only real ending is death. Everything else is a transition. Keys to warfare. The end of something, a project, a campaign, a conversation, has inordinate importance for people. It resonates in the mind. A war can begin with great fanfare and can bring many victories, but if it ends badly, that is all anyone remembers. The reason it is hard to end things well is simple. Endings inspire overpowering emotions. At the end of a bitter conflict, we have a deep desire for peace and impatience for the truce. If the conflict is bringing us victory, we often succumb to delusions of grandeur or are swept away by greed and grab for more than we need. If the conflict has been nasty, anger moves us to finish with a violent, punitive strike. If we lose, we are left with a burning desire for revenge. Emotions like these can ruin all of our prior good work. There is, in fact, nothing harder in the realm of strategy than keeping our head on straight all the way to the end and past the end. Yet nothing is more necessary. Learn the lesson well. Brilliant plans and piled-up conquests are not enough. You can become the victim of your own success, letting victory seduce you into going too far, creating hard-bitten enemies, winning the battle, but losing the political game after it. What you need is a strategic third eye, the ability to stay focused on the future while operating in the present, and ending your actions in a way that will serve your interests for the next round of war. This third eye will help you counteract the emotions that can insidiously infect your clever strategies, particularly anger and the desire for revenge. Victory and defeat are what you make of them. It is how you deal with them that matters. Since defeat is inevitable in life, you must master the art of losing well and strategically. First, think of your own mental outlook, how you absorb defeat psychologically. See it as a temporary setback, something to wake you up and teach you a lesson. And even as you lose, you end on a high note and with an edge. You are mentally prepared to go on the offensive in the next round. So often, those who have success become soft and imprudent. You must welcome defeat as a way to make yourself stronger. Second, you must see any defeat as a way to demonstrate something positive about yourself and your character to other people. This means standing tall, not showing signs of bitterness or becoming defensive. Third, if you see that defeat is inevitable, it is often best to go down swinging. That way you end on a high note even as you lose. This helps to rally the troops, giving them hope for the future. At the Battle of the Alamo in 1836, every last American fighting the Mexican army died. But they died heroically, refusing to surrender. The battle became a rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo!" And an inspired American force under Sam Houston finally defeated the Mexicans for good. You do not have to experience physical martyrdom, but a display of heroism and energy makes defeat into a moral victory that will soon enough translate into a concrete one. Planting the seeds of future victory in present defeat is strategic brilliance of the highest order. Reversal. There can be no value in ending anything badly. There is no reversal.